courtroom was already full when the doors opened quietly. People barely looked up. That alone told you everything about the man who stepped inside. He moved slowly, carefully, not trying to draw attention, not trying to avoid it either. His coat was worn from years of use, sleeves slightly too long, fabric faded by weather rather than fashion. To most people, he looked out of place, not threatening, just wrong for the room. The bailiff noticed immediately. Authority always notices what doesn't belong. He stepped forward with practiced confidence. "Sir, this is an active courtroom. If you're not part of the case, you'll need to wait outside." The man nodded politely but didn't move. Instead, he looked toward the bench, as if waiting. The bailiff's voice hardened slightly. "Sir." Still, the man didn't respond. He simply watched, and that was enough to make the room uneasy. Because people who watch quietly often carry stories no one expects. Before we begin, this is one of those stories that might change how you see people forever. If you enjoy deep emotional storytelling, gently subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered moments later, her presence restoring order instantly. "All rise." The room stood. She sat. "Be seated." Routine resumed. Files opened, names called. But halfway through the docket, something changed. Her eyes moved across the gallery, scanning faces briefly, as judges often do without thinking. Then they stopped. On him, the man near the back, standing awkwardly as the bailiff attempted once again to guide him toward the exit. The judge's hand paused above the file. A subtle hesitation, small enough that most people wouldn't notice, but enough to change everything. "Your Honor," the bailiff said quietly, "this individual is not on the docket." She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the man. Recognition moved slowly across her face. Not sudden shock, but the careful unfolding of memory. Years collapsing into a single moment. "No," she said softly. "He isn't." The courtroom waited. Silence stretched. And then she said the words that froze everyone. "Let him stay." The bailiff hesitated. It was subtle, just a brief pause, but enough for everyone in the courtroom to feel the shift. "Your Honor?" he asked carefully. Judge Eleanor Hayes did not look away from the man standing near the back row. Her expression remained composed, but something beneath the calm had changed. "Yes," she repeated quietly. "He may stay." The bailiff nodded, stepping aside, though confusion lingered in his posture. Judges did not normally make exceptions without explanation, and yet she had, without hesitation. The man lowered himself slowly into his seat. He didn't smile, didn't acknowledge anyone. He simply sat, hands folded, gaze calm, as though he had expected nothing else. Routine resumed, cases continued, names were called, arguments presented. But something invisible had entered the room. Attention drifted toward the man again and again, curiosity pulling focus away from ordinary proceedings, because authority rarely pauses for strangers. And when it does, people notice. Judge Hayes finished the current hearing, her voice steady, her decisions precise, but every few minutes her eyes returned to him. Memory pressed against her thoughts, not fully formed yet, just fragments, a hallway, a different building, a voice speaking quietly but firmly. She turned another page, signed another order, but the feeling remained. She knew him. After the final case on the docket concluded, she closed the file gently. "That will conclude today's scheduled hearings," she said. The room began to move. Chairs shifting, papers gathering, people preparing to leave. Then she raised her hand. One moment, everyone froze again. Her gaze moved toward the gallery. "Sir," she said softly, "please, approach." The man stood slowly. Every eye followed him as he walked toward the front. His movements were careful, almost deliberate, not nervous, not confident, simply measured. He stopped several feet from the bench, close enough for recognition to settle fully. Up close, the lines on his face told stories of time, not just aging, experience, loss, endurance. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. "State your name." The question sounded routine, but her tone carried something else. Expectation. The man nodded. "Samuel Carter," he said quietly. The name landed softly. But for her, it hit like a memory unlocking. Her breath paused almost imperceptibly. Samuel Carter. Of course, years earlier, a stormy night, a courthouse evacuation, a young judge overwhelmed by her first major crisis, and a security officer who had refused to leave until everyone else was safe. She remembered his calm voice guiding people through chaos. She remembered him standing at the doors long after danger had passed. She remembered thinking, some people carry authority without titles. "You worked here," she said quietly. "Yes, Your Honor." "Court security?" "Yes." The courtroom murmured softly. The bailiff blinked, surprised. He'd never seen this man before. That meant the memory was old. Very old. Judge Hayes studied him carefully. "What brings you here today, Mr. Carter?" He hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. "I came to watch," he said simply. "To watch?" she repeated. "Yes." Silence deepened. The answer felt incomplete, but honest. She tilted her head slightly. "You haven't worked here in years." "No." "And yet you chose today to return." "Yes." The room leaned forward collectively, because something about this exchange felt personal, important, unfinished. Judge Hayes's voice softened slightly. "Is there a reason you waited until now?" Samuel hesitated again. His eyes moved briefly across the courtroom, taking in the walls, the benches, the space filled with memories no one else could see. Then he looked back at her. "Yes." A pause. "I needed to know if you still remembered." The words settled like a quiet shock. The room froze. Authority and vulnerability collided in a single moment. Judge Hayes felt the weight of his statement deeply, because suddenly this wasn't just about recognition. It was about something lost, something unfinished between past and present. She leaned back slowly, and for the first time since the hearing began, emotion touched her voice openly. "I never forgot." The silence that followed felt alive, because now everyone understood. This man wasn't just a visitor. He was part of a story no one else knew yet. And whatever that story was, it had brought him back. The words, "I never forgot," lingered in the air long after Judge Eleanor Hayes spoke them. They were simple, quiet, but they carried weight. The kind of weight that comes from shared history, from moments that shape people long after they end. Samuel Carter stood silently before the bench, his posture respectful but steady. He wasn't seeking attention. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was waiting for something only the judge could understand. The courtroom remained unusually still. People who had been preparing to leave slowly returned to their seats. The bailiff moved toward the side wall, his earlier certainty replaced with curiosity. Because now it was clear. This was no longer an interruption. It was a story unfolding. Judge Hayes folded her hands. "You said you came to watch," she said gently. "But I suspect there's more to it than that." Samuel nodded once. "There is." "Then tell me." He hesitated. Not because he didn't want to speak, but because some truths feel heavier when said out loud. "I saw your name on the docket list," he said quietly. "You came because of me." "Yes." Silence deepened. The defense attorney, still packing her files, paused mid-motion. The prosecutor leaned slightly forward. Even the clerk stopped typing. Authority had shifted again, not toward law, but toward something personal. Judge Hayes tilted her head slightly. "You haven't contacted the court in years," she said. "No. And yet you returned today." "Yes. Why now?" Samuel exhaled slowly. "Because I heard about a case last month." "What case?" "A security officer who froze during an emergency evacuation," he said. The room grew quiet again. Judge Hayes's expression tightened slightly. She remembered the incident, a courthouse fire alarm that caused chaos, confusion, and criticism of security response. "And?" she asked gently. "They said he panicked," Samuel continued. "Said he wasn't ready for responsibility." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And you disagreed?" "Yes." A pause. "Why?" Samuel looked at the floor briefly before answering. "Because no one understands what that job really feels like until the moment comes." The words carried experience, not theory. The courtroom listened. "You came to defend him?" she said softly. Samuel shook his head. "No." "Then why?" He met her eyes again. "Because I wanted to see if you still believed what you told me years ago." Her breath paused slightly. "And what was that?" "That people aren't defined by one moment." Silence fell hard, deep, meaningful. Memory returned fully now. Years earlier, Samuel Carter had stood in this same courtroom, not as a visitor, not as staff, but as someone facing disciplinary review after an incident gone wrong. A frightened witness had escaped during transport. Public criticism followed. His career had nearly ended, and she had said those words. People aren't defined by one moment. She had believed it then, and she believed it now. "You're here because you're worried about him," she said. "Yes." "Why does it matter to you?" Samuel hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because someone once gave me a second chance." The emotional reversal began quietly. The man everyone assumed didn't belong here had once protected this place, had once stood at the center of judgment himself. And now he had returned not for himself, but for someone else. The prosecutor spoke cautiously. "Your Honor, is this connected to any active proceeding?" Judge Hayes considered the question. "Not directly," she said, "but it speaks to character, and character often shapes justice." Authority shock again, because suddenly the courtroom wasn't just about cases, it was about the people behind them. Samuel shifted slightly. "I didn't come to interrupt," he said quietly. "I just needed to know if you still saw people the same way." She studied him carefully. "And what do you see now?" He hesitated. Then a faint smile appeared. "I see you didn't change." The room felt warmer somehow, less formal, more human. Judge Hayes allowed herself a small breath. "Mr. Carter, there is something you should know." He waited. "That officer you mentioned, his review hearing is tomorrow." Samuel blinked, surprised. "And?" She leaned forward slightly. "And I believe your presence today wasn't coincidence." The words carried quiet significance, because suddenly his return felt less like nostalgia and more like purpose. The courtroom held its breath, because everyone sensed something deeper was about to unfold, and whatever it was, would change how they saw him entirely. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier now. Not tense, not uncomfortable, but filled with something deeper, anticipation mixed with understanding. Judge Eleanor Hayes watched Samuel Carter closely, as if waiting for him to say what she already sensed. "You mentioned the officer scheduled for tomorrow," she said gently. "You seem personally invested." Samuel hesitated. Years of restraint showed in the way he held himself, shoulders slightly forward, hands clasped together, as though he had practiced staying quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said finally, "I am." The defense attorney, still seated nearby, stopped packing her files completely. The prosecutor leaned forward, curiosity overtaking formality, because now it was clear. This wasn't just about a former security officer returning to watch court proceedings. This was about something unfinished. "What is your connection to him?" the judge asked. Samuel swallowed slowly. "He's my son." The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. The courtroom fell silent. The bailiff's posture straightened. The clerk looked up sharply. Even the quiet hum of the lights felt louder. Judge Hayes felt the weight of the revelation settle deeply. "Your son," she repeated. "Yes." "And he never told the court?" Samuel shook his head. "He didn't want anyone to think he got special treatment." A faint smile touched her lips. "That sounds familiar." He nodded slightly. "It does." Memory returned again. Years earlier, Samuel had refused to use connections or favors during his own disciplinary review. He had insisted on standing alone. Now, his son was doing the same. The realization carried emotional weight. "What is his name?" she asked. "Ethan Carter." Recognition flickered again across her face. She had seen the file. A young officer, first major incident. Criticism harsh and immediate. Accused of freezing during an emergency evacuation. The parallels between father and son felt undeniable. "And you came today," she said softly, "because you wanted to know whether I still believed in second chances." "Yes." Silence followed. Because the question behind his words wasn't legal. It was personal. Did she still see people beyond their worst moments? The judge leaned back slightly. "Tell me something honestly," she said. "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you believe your son failed?" Samuel hesitated. His answer came slowly. "No." "What do you believe happened?" "He was overwhelmed," he said quietly. "Not because he lacks courage, but because he cares too much." The words hung in the air. Caring too much. An unexpected perspective. The prosecutor shifted. "Your Honor, if this relates to tomorrow's hearing, it may be more appropriate addressed then." She nodded gently. "Yes, but context matters." Her gaze returned to Samuel. "What do you want from this court?" He hesitated again. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Nothing?" "I didn't come to ask for leniency," he said. "I came to see if he would be seen as a person, not just a mistake." The emotional reversal deepened. The man the bailiff tried to remove wasn't seeking influence. He was seeking reassurance. Judge Hayes felt a familiar sense of responsibility settle over her. Years earlier, she had looked at Samuel Carter and chosen understanding over judgment. Now, she faced the possibility of doing the same for his son. History repeating, but differently. "You understand," she said gently, "that tomorrow's decision will be based on evidence." "Yes." "And not on your past with this court." "Yes." "But you came anyway." He nodded. "I needed to know if hope was still allowed here." The words landed with quiet power. The courtroom felt changed again, not by drama, but by honesty. The audience no longer saw Samuel as a stranger. They saw a father, a man returning to the place where his own life had once shifted. Judge Hayes studied him carefully, then spoke softly. "You said earlier that someone once gave you a second chance." "Yes." "And that changed everything." Yes, she nodded slowly. Then perhaps you already know the answer to your question. He watched her closely, waiting. She allowed a small pause. For this court, she said gently, people are never reduced to one moment. Samuel's shoulders lowered slightly, relief without celebration, because sometimes hearing something again matters more than hearing it for the first time. But the story wasn't finished, because as the room settled into quiet understanding, another realization began to form. And when she spoke again, her voice carried new curiosity. There is something else, she said softly. Samuel looked up. You didn't just come to watch, did you? The room leaned forward, because now the real reason for his return was about to surface. The question hung quietly in the air. You didn't just come to watch, did you? Judge Eleanor Hayes's voice was calm, but beneath it lived certainty, the kind that comes from years of recognizing when someone is holding back part of their story. Samuel Carter did not answer immediately. He stood still before the bench, eyes lowered slightly, as though weighing whether the truth belonged in this room. The courtroom leaned forward without realizing it, because everyone sensed something deeper waited beneath his silence. No, he said finally. The word was soft, but it shifted everything. The prosecutor straightened. The defense attorney paused completely. Even the bailiff, who only minutes earlier had tried to escort him out, watched closely now. Judge Hayes nodded gently. Then tell me why you're really here. Samuel exhaled slowly. Years seemed to move through him in that breath. I received a letter, he said. A letter? Yes. From whom? He hesitated. I don't know. Curiosity tightened instantly. What did it say? She asked. He reached slowly into his coat pocket, every movement careful, respectful. The bailiff stepped slightly closer, instinct, not suspicion. Samuel handed the folded paper to the clerk, who passed it to the bench. Judge Hayes opened it carefully. The room held its breath. Her eyes moved across the page, once, then again. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for those watching closely to notice. Recognition, concern, something heavier. What is it, Your Honor? The prosecutor asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Samuel. When did you receive this? 3 days ago. And this is why you came today? Yes, she read aloud slowly. If you want to protect your son, come back to the place where your story began. Some truths were never finished. Silence filled the courtroom, not confusion, something deeper, a sense that the past was reaching forward again. Do you know who sent it? She asked. Samuel shook his head. No return address, no signature. And you believed it was connected to your son's hearing? Yes. Why? He hesitated. Because the wording. It sounded like someone who knew what happened years ago. The emotional tension deepened, because suddenly this wasn't just about a father supporting his child. It was about unfinished history. Judge Hayes folded the letter slowly. Memory pressed against her thoughts again. Years earlier. Samuel Carter's disciplinary hearing had been controversial, not because of wrongdoing, but because of conflicting accounts of what truly happened during that courthouse incident. Official records said one thing, but she had always suspected there was more. She looked up again. Mr. Carter, is there anything from your past here that remains unresolved? He hesitated longer this time. Yes. The word felt heavier. What was never finished? She asked. Samuel's voice lowered slightly. The report from that night. What report? The incident report, he said. The one that closed my case. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You believe it was incomplete? I know it was. The courtroom froze again. Authority shock moved quietly through the space, because now the narrative had shifted once more. Samuel wasn't just returning for his son. He had been called back. Someone wanted the past reopened. The prosecutor spoke carefully. Your Honor, if this relates to a closed internal matter. She raised her hand gently. One moment. Her gaze remained on Samuel. You never challenged the report at the time? No. Why? He swallowed. Because I thought protecting others mattered more than protecting myself. Silence. Deep. Heavy. The words landed with emotional force. For years, Samuel Carter had carried something alone, and now, someone wanted it uncovered. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. Mr. Carter, what truth do you believe was hidden? He met her eyes directly. That I didn't freeze that night. The room went completely still. The words settled slowly into the room. I didn't freeze that night. Samuel Carter's voice wasn't loud. It wasn't defensive. It carried no anger, only quiet certainty, the kind that comes from holding on to truth for a long time without anyone asking to hear it. The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Eleanor Hayes felt the weight of his statement immediately. Because if he hadn't frozen during the evacuation, then something else had happened. Something the official record had not captured. She leaned forward slightly. Explain, she said gently. Samuel nodded once. His hands tightened together, then relaxed. The alarm went off, he began. Smoke filled the hallway. People panicked. Everyone moved toward the exits at once. Memory shaped his voice. Steady, detailed, precise. I was assigned to secure the North Corridor. And, she asked, I stayed longer than protocol allowed. The prosecutor frowned. That could be interpreted as hesitation, he said cautiously. Samuel shook his head. No, he said quietly. I stayed because someone was still inside. The room leaned forward. Who? The judge asked. He hesitated. An intern. Silence deepened. She was trapped behind a locked office door, he continued. The locking system malfunctioned during the alarm. She couldn't get out. Judge Hayes felt something shift in her memory. Fragments resurfacing, reports mentioning delays, confusion about evacuation timing. But not this. Never this. You never mentioned this during the hearing, she said. Samuel's gaze lowered slightly. They told me not to. The words landed heavily. Who told you that? Administration, he said. They said the system malfunction would create liability. They wanted a clean narrative, that I froze, that response time failed because of me. The courtroom reacted with quiet murmurs. Authority shock building. The prosecutor spoke carefully. Mr. Carter, are you suggesting the official report was altered? I'm saying it wasn't complete, he replied. What happened to the intern? Judge Hayes asked softly. Samuel's eyes lifted. She made it out. A pause. But only because I stayed. The room grew still again. Because suddenly, everything changed. The man once labeled as someone who hesitated in crisis had actually chosen to remain behind to save someone else. Judge Hayes felt a deep unease. Years earlier, she had sensed something missing from the report. But the official documentation had appeared clear. Protocol violation, delayed evacuation, case closed. Now she realized the truth had been simplified, and simplification had become injustice. Why didn't you fight the report? She asked quietly. Samuel hesitated. Because the intern was young, new. They told me she might face scrutiny if the system failure became public. So you accepted blame to protect her? Yes. Silence, heavy and emotional. The bailiff shifted slightly. The defense attorney lowered her eyes. Even the prosecutor seemed uncertain. Because now, Samuel Carter wasn't just a former officer returning for his son. He was someone who had sacrificed his own reputation to protect another person. Judge Hayes spoke carefully. Do you know who sent the letter encouraging you to return? Samuel shook his head. No. But whoever it was knew the truth. Yes. She nodded slowly. And they believe it matters now. Yes. Her mind moved quickly. If the past report had been incomplete, if Samuel had been misrepresented, then the emotional context surrounding his son's case changed dramatically, not legally, but morally. Because history shapes perception, and perception shapes judgment. She leaned back slightly. This court cannot reopen a closed internal investigation without formal petition, she said calmly. Samuel nodded. I understand. But the word carried quiet authority. If new information exists, it deserves to be heard. The room felt the shift immediately. Authority aligning with truth. Samuel exhaled slowly. Relief touched his expression, not because anything had changed legally yet, but because someone finally listened. Judge Hayes studied him carefully. And tomorrow, she said gently, your son will stand before this court carrying a version of your story without knowing the full truth behind it. Samuel nodded. Yes, and that may be why someone asked you to return. The realization settled heavily. Because this wasn't just about the past. It was about breaking a pattern. The courtroom held its breath. Something larger was unfolding, something emotional and deeply human. And everyone sensed that another revelation waited just ahead. The silence that followed felt different now. Not tense, not uncertain, but heavy with realization. As though the room itself had begun to understand that Samuel Carter's story was far from finished. Judge Eleanor Hayes remained still behind the bench, her gaze steady on him. You said you stayed behind for an intern, she said gently. Yes. And that detail was left out of the report. Yes. She nodded slowly. There's something else, isn't there? Samuel hesitated. The kind of hesitation that comes when truth carries consequences. Not legal ones, but emotional ones. Yes, he said quietly. The courtroom leaned forward collectively. Every person present sensed that this was the moment when the hidden past would finally come into focus. Judge Hayes spoke softly. Who is the intern? Samuel looked down briefly, gathering himself. Then he lifted his eyes. She works here now. The room froze. Here, the judge asked. Yes. Who? He hesitated again, not because he didn't want to answer, but because saying the name meant reopening something deeply personal. She's part of the court staff. The clerk looked up sharply. The bailiff shifted. The defense attorney stopped moving entirely. Authority shock began to build quietly. Judge Hayes's voice lowered. Say her name. Samuel inhaled slowly. Emily Rivera. The name landed softly, but its impact was immediate, because Emily Rivera sat only a few feet away, the courtroom clerk who had been organizing files all morning. Her pen slipped from her hand. The sound echoed louder than it should have. She looked up slowly, eyes wide, confusion moving across her face as memory began to surface. Samuel watched her carefully, not accusing, not expecting recognition, simply waiting. Judge Hayes turned toward her. Ms. Rivera, do you recognize Mr. Carter? Emily hesitated. She studied him closely. searching through years, through faces blurred by time, and then understanding began to form. Her hand moved slowly toward her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Memory returned. Smoke, alarms, a locked door that wouldn't open, a calm voice outside telling her to breathe, telling her she wasn't alone. She had never known who stayed behind, never known someone had taken the blame to protect her. Tears filled her eyes. "It was you," she said softly. Samuel nodded once. "Yes." The courtroom felt suspended in emotion. Authority shock reached another level. The quiet clerk, no one noticed all morning, had been at the center of the event that reshaped Samuel's life. Judge Hayes watched carefully, her voice gentle but steady. "You were the intern he protected." Emily nodded slowly. "I didn't know," she said, voice shaking. "They told me the evacuation delay was procedural confusion. They never said anyone stayed behind." Samuel lowered his gaze slightly. "That was intentional." Silence deepened, because now the hidden truth had fully emerged. The man once blamed for hesitation had been protecting someone who now worked within the very system that misunderstood him. Years of narrative reversed in a single moment. Emily stepped forward slightly, emotion breaking through her professional composure. "You lost your career because of me?" "No," Samuel said gently. "I made my choice." "But you never told anyone." "It wasn't about recognition." The words carried quiet power. Judge Hayes felt something shift deeply inside her. Years earlier, she had believed she saw the full truth. Now she understood how much had remained hidden beneath official language. She spoke carefully. "Ms. Rivera, did you ever file a supplemental report about the locked door malfunction?" Emily shook her head slowly. "They told me it wasn't necessary. Said the system error had already been documented." Her voice lowered. "I trusted that." The realization spread through the room like a wave. Trust had allowed a false narrative to stand. Samuel spoke again quietly. "I never wanted you to feel responsible." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "But I am," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "No. Responsibility belongs to the truth, not to the people caught inside it." The emotional reversal reached its peak. The man once dismissed as someone who failed had actually saved someone who now helped uphold the court. Judge Hayes leaned back slowly. The weight of history pressed heavily around her. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "this changes everything." He gave a faint, tired smile. "I didn't come to change the past." "Then why did you come?" He hesitated, then answered honestly. "So my son wouldn't grow up believing silence is the same as failure." The words landed with deep emotional force. And in that moment, the courtroom understood. This wasn't just about reopening history. It was about breaking a cycle. The courtroom did not return to normal after Emily Rivera spoke. It couldn't. Something deeper had entered the space, a quiet understanding that the story unfolding was no longer about one man or one moment, but about the ripple effects of decisions made years ago. Emily stood near the clerk's desk, her composure shaken for the first time since the hearing began. "I didn't know," she repeated softly. Her voice carried both relief and guilt. Samuel watched her calmly. "You weren't meant to," he said gently. "But you lost everything," she whispered. He shook his head. "I lost a job," he said. "Not who I am." The simplicity of the statement settled heavily across the room. Judge Eleanor Hayes allowed the silence to breathe. Moments like this required space, not interruption. She studied both of them carefully. Two people connected by a history neither had fully understood until now. "Ms. Rivera," she said softly, Did you ever question why the report excluded mention of Mr. Carter's actions? Emily hesitated. I was young, she admitted. I trusted the system. They told me it was complete. A pause. And you believed them? Yes. The judge nodded slowly. Trust had shaped this story as much as truth. The prosecutor shifted slightly, uncertain where the boundaries of the hearing now lay. Your Honor, while this information is emotionally significant, I'm unsure how it relates to any active legal matter. She looked toward him calmly. It relates to understanding context, she said, and context shapes how this court evaluates people. Authorities spoke gently but firmly. No one argued. Samuel stood quietly, hands clasped together, as if unsure where to place himself in the moment. Years ago, he had accepted silence to protect someone else. Now that silence was breaking, and with it came something unexpected. Recognition. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. There is something we must consider carefully, she said. The room stilled again. Tomorrow's hearing involves your son, Ethan Carter. Samuel nodded. Yes. His case centers on allegations that he hesitated during an emergency response. Yes. Her eyes softened slightly. And now we understand that the narrative surrounding hesitation may not always reflect the truth. The words carried quiet authority. The emotional parallel between father and son became impossible to ignore. Emily stepped forward slightly, emotion still visible in her expression. Your Honor, if what happened to Mr. Carter wasn't fully documented, could the same thing be happening now? The question hung in the air. Powerful, unavoidable. Judge Hayes considered it carefully. That is precisely why tomorrow's hearing must be approached with care, she said. Samuel looked down briefly. I don't want special treatment for him, he said. She nodded. I understand. I just want him to be seen fully. The simplicity of his request made it heavier. Not leniency. Not protection. Just understanding. Judge Hayes felt a familiar sense of responsibility settle over her again. Years earlier, she had chosen to look deeper than the surface. Now, history presented another chance. But this time, the stakes extended beyond one person. They touched generations. She spoke carefully. This court cannot change what has already been decided in the past, she said gently, but it can ensure that the future is guided by clarity. Samuel nodded slowly. That's all I hoped for. The courtroom felt quieter now, not heavy, not tense, but reflective. People began to understand that what they had witnessed was not coincidence. It was connection, the past reaching forward to reshape the present. Judge Hayes glanced at the clock. We will conclude for today. The room shifted slightly, but she raised her hand. One more thing. Everyone froze again. Her gaze moved from Samuel to Emily, then across the entire room. Sometimes, she said softly, the truth returns not to change history, but to change how we carry it. The words settled deeply, because they weren't just for Samuel. They were for everyone listening. Samuel exhaled slowly. For years he had carried the belief that silence defined him. Now he realized silence had only delayed understanding. It had never erased the truth. As people began gathering their things, Emily approached him carefully. I owe you more than an apology, she said quietly. He shook his head. You don't owe me anything. But I want to help, she said. How? Tomorrow, she said softly. I want to testify. The room froze again. Authority shock, because suddenly the next hearing had transformed, and everyone sensed that tomorrow would not unfold the way anyone expected. The courtroom did not empty quickly. People lingered longer than usual, conversations hushed but intense, as though everyone sensed they had witnessed something meaningful, something that would echo into tomorrow. Samuel Carter stood quietly near the front, unsure whether to leave or remain. Emily Rivera stayed beside him, her posture no longer just professional, but personal. The story had changed both of them. Judge Eleanor Hayes gathered her papers slowly, but her thoughts were already moving ahead. Tomorrow's hearing. Ethan Carter, a young officer accused of hesitation, a narrative that now felt uncomfortably familiar. She paused before leaving the bench, looking toward Samuel again. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "please remain a moment." The room stilled again. The bailiff closed the doors quietly, allowing only a handful of people to remain. Samuel stepped closer. Emily stayed nearby, uncertain whether she should remain, until the judge nodded slightly, granting silent permission. "Tomorrow will be difficult," Judge Hayes said calmly. Samuel nodded. "I know. And I want to be clear," she continued. "Nothing we discuss today guarantees any outcome. I understand." His voice held no expectation, only acceptance. She leaned forward slightly. "What concerns me," she said, "is the pattern." Samuel looked up. "The pattern?" "Yes," she replied. "Your story suggests that what appears to be hesitation may actually be something else, something unseen." The words carried quiet weight. Emily spoke softly. "I've reviewed several incident summaries for court security," she said. "Reports are often simplified. They rarely include emotional context or environmental factors." The prosecutor, still present, nodded reluctantly. "That's standard documentation practice." Judge Hayes's gaze sharpened slightly. "And sometimes standard practices create incomplete truths." Silence followed, authority aligning with reflection. Samuel exhaled slowly. "I don't want my son's case judged through my story," he said. "It won't be," she assured him, "but it will be judged with awareness." That distinction mattered. She opened a file on her desk, Ethan Carter's preliminary report. "I reviewed this earlier," she said. "It states that Officer Carter paused for approximately 22 seconds during evacuation protocol." Samuel lowered his gaze slightly. "Yes. Witness accounts say he appeared frozen." Emily frowned gently. That language sounds familiar. The parallel between father and son deepened. Judge Hayes tapped the page lightly. "There's no mention of why he paused." The prosecutor shrugged slightly. "Because intent cannot always be determined." "But absence of explanation is not the same as absence of reason," she replied. Authority carried calmly. Samuel hesitated. "He hasn't told me everything," he admitted. "Why not?" she asked gently. "He doesn't want me to worry." A faint smile crossed her face. "That also sounds familiar." He nodded. The emotional tension deepened, because now tomorrow's hearing felt less like a disciplinary review and more like a moment where history might repeat or finally change. Judge Hayes closed the file slowly. "There is something else," she said. The room leaned forward again. "I received a supplemental report this afternoon." "What kind of report?" the prosecutor asked. "An internal review from the emergency response team." She paused. "And it includes a detail not present in the initial summary." Samuel's breath tightened slightly. "What detail?" Her voice softened. "It states that Officer Carter paused because he was speaking to someone through a closed door." The room froze, authority shock. Samuel blinked. "A door?" "Yes." Emily's eyes widened. "A trapped individual?" Judge Hayes nodded slowly. "That is what the report suggests." Silence filled the room, history repeating itself. A father once labeled as someone who froze, now mirrored by a son facing the same narrative. Samuel's voice lowered. He stayed behind for someone. The realization landed heavily. Judge Hayes met his gaze. That appears to be the case. Emotion moved quietly through the room, not dramatic, but powerful. Because suddenly, tomorrow's hearing wasn't just about protocol, it was about truth resurfacing again. She leaned back slowly. Tomorrow, she said gently, we must listen carefully. Samuel nodded. And for the first time since entering the courtroom, something like hope appeared in his eyes. Outside, evening light faded slowly. Inside, the past and present had aligned, and everyone sensed that tomorrow would change everything. Morning arrived quietly. The courthouse felt different than usual, not louder, not more crowded, but heavier with anticipation. Word had spread among staff and regular observers that something unusual had happened the previous day. A former security officer had returned. A hidden truth had surfaced. And today, his son would stand before the court. Samuel Carter arrived early. He stood near the back of the courtroom, just as he had the day before, hands folded, posture calm but carrying the weight of memory. Emily Rivera entered shortly after, offering him a small nod. The unspoken understanding between them felt strong now. Two people bound by a moment, neither had fully understood until yesterday. The bailiff took his place near the door, his earlier skepticism replaced by quiet respect. All rise. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered, her presence restoring stillness instantly. She sat. Be seated. Routine began, but everyone felt it. Today was not routine. The clerk called the case. Officer Ethan Carter. The door opened, and a young man stepped forward. Ethan Carter moved with careful discipline, uniform pressed, shoulders squared, but something beneath the surface felt uncertain. He stopped at the defense table, eyes briefly scanning the room. Then he saw his father. Surprise crossed his face. Not shock, something deeper. Concern. Why was he here? Samuel gave only a small nod, reassurance without interference. Judge Hayes studied Ethan carefully. The resemblance was undeniable, not just physically, in posture, in the way he stood slightly forward as though ready to accept whatever came next. Officer Carter, she said calmly. Yes, Your Honor. You understand the purpose of today's hearing? Yes. Please summarize the events of the evacuation. His voice remained steady. The alarm triggered. I began clearing the east corridor. When I reached the storage wing, I paused. The word hung heavily. Paused. History echoed. And why did you pause? She asked gently. He hesitated, eyes flickering briefly toward his father before returning to the bench. There was a voice behind a locked door, he said quietly. The room stilled, authority shock building again. What kind of voice? She asked. A civilian, he said. Panic. They couldn't open the door. Silence deepened. Judge Hayes felt the parallel settle heavily. Years earlier, Samuel Carter had stood in almost the exact same position. What did you do? She asked. I tried to override the lock, he said. The system failed. And? I stayed. The words landed softly but powerfully. The courtroom leaned forward. You remained behind despite evacuation protocol, she said. Yes. Why? He hesitated. Because this was the moment that defined everything. Because leaving them would have been wrong, he said quietly. The emotional reversal completed. The son had repeated the father's choice. Not hesitation, courage. The prosecutor shifted slightly. Your Honor, while admirable, deviation from protocol carries risk. Judge Hayes nodded gently. Yes, and context determines meaning. Her eyes moved toward Samuel briefly, recognition passing silently between them. Was the civilian successfully evacuated? She asked Ethan. Yes. Did you report the malfunction? Yes. And yet the initial summary describes your actions as hesitation. He lowered his gaze slightly. I didn't challenge the wording. Why not? He hesitated. I didn't want to make excuses. The words mirrored his father almost exactly. Judge Hayes leaned back slowly. The courtroom felt suspended between past and present. 2 stories, 2 generations, the same misunderstanding. Emily stepped forward carefully. Your Honor, may I speak? The judge nodded. Emily took a breath. I want to testify, she said. The room froze again, authority shock rising toward its peak. Because now, the past itself was stepping into the present to change the future. The request hung in the air like a quiet turning point. I want to testify. Emily Rivera's voice was steady, but emotion lived just beneath the surface. Judge Eleanor Hayes studied her carefully. This hearing concerns Officer Carter, she said gently. Explain how your testimony is relevant. Emily nodded, gathering herself. Because what happened to him already happened once before. The room froze. Samuel lowered his gaze slightly. Ethan looked between them, confusion growing. What does that mean? He asked softly. Judge Hayes gave a small nod. You may proceed. Emily stepped forward. Her usual composure as court clerk softened into something more personal, vulnerable but determined. Years ago, she began, I was an intern here. Ethan listened carefully. Samuel remained still, allowing her to speak. There was an evacuation, she continued. A malfunction trapped me behind a locked door. I panicked. Her voice trembled slightly. And someone stayed behind to help me. She turned toward Samuel. It was your father. The words landed like a quiet shockwave. Ethan blinked. You? Samuel nodded once. The room fell completely silent. Emily continued. The official report never mentioned what he did. It described him as hesitating. But he wasn't hesitating. He was saving me. The emotional weight deepened, because now the past wasn't just memory. It was testimony. Judge Hayes watched carefully. Years earlier, she had sensed something incomplete. Now the truth unfolded fully. Emily took a breath. When I read Officer Carter's report, the language felt familiar, the same simplification, the same assumption. She turned toward Ethan. You didn't freeze. You stayed for someone. He hesitated. Yes. And you accepted blame because you didn't want to argue. He nodded slowly. Yes. Authority shock reached its peak. The courtroom understood the pattern now. 2 generations, 2 moments of courage misunderstood as hesitation. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. Officer Carter, she said gently, why didn't you explain your actions more clearly in the initial report? Ethan hesitated. I didn't want to sound like I was making excuses, he said quietly. I thought the result mattered more than how it looked. Samuel's expression softened. The parallel between them felt undeniable. The prosecutor spoke cautiously. Your Honor, deviation from protocol still requires evaluation. Yes, she replied calmly, but protocol exists to protect people, not punish those who act to save them. The distinction settled deeply. She turned toward Samuel. You once told me something I never forgot, she said softly. Samuel tilted his head slightly. That people are not defined by one moment, she continued. He nodded. And today, she said gently, your son demonstrated the same belief. Silence filled the room, Not heavy, not tense, just meaningful. Judge Hayes closed the file slowly. Her voice carried calm authority. This court recognizes that Officer Carter's actions were not hesitation, but deliberate decision-making under pressure. Ethan's breath caught slightly. Protocol deviations require review, she continued, but they must be evaluated within full context. She paused, and context now includes testimony demonstrating a pattern of courage rather than failure. The emotional climax settled quietly. Not dramatic, not loud, but deeply powerful. Ethan glanced toward his father, understanding moving slowly across his face. Years of unspoken history suddenly visible. Judge Hayes lifted the gavel slightly, but did not strike it yet. "Before I conclude," she said softly, "there is something everyone in this room should understand." The room leaned forward. "Justice is not only about rules," she said. "It is about recognizing the difference between hesitation and humanity." The words landed deeply. She struck the gavel gently. "Disciplinary action is dismissed. Officer Carter is cleared to return to duty." The sound echoed quietly, final, undeniable. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Samuel exhaled slowly. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. The courtroom did not erupt. Instead, a quiet understanding settled, because what had happened felt bigger than a verdict. It felt like history correcting itself. The sound of the gavel faded slowly into silence. No applause, no dramatic reaction, just a deep collective exhale, the kind that comes when something heavy finally settles into place. Officer Ethan Carter remained standing for a moment longer, absorbing the judge's words. Cleared to return to duty. Simple language, life-changing meaning. He turned slowly toward his father. For years, Samuel Carter had been a quiet figure in his life, supportive, steady, but never fully open about the past. Now, suddenly, pieces of a story he never knew existed stood clearly before him. "You stayed," Ethan said quietly. Samuel nodded. "Yes, and you never told me." "It wasn't about me," he replied gently. Ethan shook his head slightly. "It is now." The words carried more gratitude than accusation. Emily Rivera watched them carefully, emotion still visible in her expression. For years, she had carried an incomplete memory, a blurred moment from a frightening night. Now she understood the cost someone else had paid for her safety. She stepped closer to Samuel. "I'm sorry it took this long for the truth to be spoken," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Truth doesn't expire," he replied. "Sometimes it just waits." Judge Eleanor Hayes gathered her papers slowly, observing quietly from the bench. This was why she had chosen the law. Not for power, not for authority, but for moments like this, when understanding reshaped the outcome. She watched father and son standing together. 2 generations connected by the same choice. Staying when leaving would have been easier, choosing people over protocol. The courtroom began to move again. Chairs shifted, files closed, people prepared to leave. But something had changed, not just for Samuel or Ethan, but for everyone who witnessed the story unfold. Because sometimes justice is not loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly and stays. As Ethan gathered his belongings, he turned back toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said. "Yes, Officer Carter?" He hesitated. "Thank you for seeing the full story." Judge Hayes gave a small nod. "Always tell the full story," she said gently, "even when you think no one is listening." He nodded and understood. Outside the courthouse, sunlight stretched across the steps. Samuel and Ethan walked side by side in silence for a moment. Neither rushed to fill it. Finally, Ethan spoke. "You weren't afraid they would judge you again?" Samuel smiled slightly. "Fear isn't the problem," he said. "Silence is." Ethan thought about that as they continued walking. Years of misunderstanding had ended not with confrontation, but with recognition. Behind them, Emily stood near the entrance, watching quietly. She realized something important then. The system hadn't changed overnight, but people within it had listened differently. And sometimes that was enough to start something new. Inside, Judge Hayes prepared for the next case, another file, another story, another person whose life might turn on a single moment of understanding. She paused briefly before opening it, because today had reminded her of something essential. People are never just what reports say they are. They are the moments no one sees, the choices made when no one is watching and somewhere else. Another story was already beginning. Another person misunderstood, another quiet moment waiting to be recognized. This was never just about one man standing in the wrong place. It was about what happens when someone finally sees who was there all along.